All right, let's dive into the stack of sources we've got today. It's a real mix, covering everything from the complex political fight over a major budget bill here in Washington
Right.
to surprising ways financial markets are reacting, some truly concerning reports about the human impact of policy decisions, and even how some of these political trends are echoing in elections, far away.
It's quite a range.
Yeah, we're working from recent articles, breaking down the political battles, the fallout, the commentary, plus this research paper that takes a really deep look at the financial market side of the U.S. debt limit.
Okay.
So our goal is pretty simple. Cut through the noise, pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising facts these sources reveal, and help you understand what it all means for you. Let's unpack this stack.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
So leading the charge really is this major budget bill. It's been front and center. These sources paint a clear picture. While the bill was supposedly, tailor-made for one key figure, actually getting it passed is proving, well, incredibly difficult.
And what jumps out immediately is just how complex the opposition is. It's not one thing, and it's even coming from within the party pushing it. Resistance from multiple directions.
Exactly. On one side, the sources talk about a group they call the tap the brakes senators. These are moderates, specifically worried about cuts to health insurance.
Okay.
We're talking senators like Susan Collins, Josh Hawley, Jim Justice, Jerry Moran, Lisa Murkowski.
That lineup immediately makes you ask, how much power do they actually have? The analysis in the sources is pretty blunt.
Yeah.
It only takes 4 Republican votes against it to stop it cold in the Senate. That list had 5 names.
Right.
And remember, some, like Collins and Murkowski, they've shown they're willing to break ranks on issues like this.
And the bill's proponents, they're trying this specific talking point. They aren't cutting people off Medicaid. They're saying people are kicking themselves off by, not meeting requirements. Yeah, and the sources suggest if those moderate senators aren't buying that spin, the whole math of balancing tax cuts with spending cuts just, well, it falls apart.
Because if those Medicaid cuts disappear, the bill hits a major roadblock.
Right.
Either the deficit projection goes way up.
Or the tax cuts shrink.
Exactly. And neither option is going to win you votes, not in the Senate, not in the House.
But wait, there's the other side. The hit the gas group, senators like Ron Johnson, Rand Paul, they look at this bill and think it doesn't cut enough spending.
And the sources are clear. Their positions are pretty rigid on that.
Yeah.
So that puts leadership in a real bind. To get the hardliners, they need deeper cuts.
Which loses more moderates.
Almost certainly. The prediction from the sources is pretty stark. 4 nay votes look practically guaranteed with Collins, Murkowski, Johnson, and Paul.
And it's not just lawmakers. The sources point to big names outside Congress like Elon Musk, Governor Ron DeSantis.
Also weighing in.
Yeah, publicly criticizing it, saying it doesn't go far enough on cuts.
Wow.
Beyond the politics, the sources highlight actual economic blowback. The markets. Interestingly, they're not reacting well. Interest rates on government bonds, they've climbed, and crucially, they're staying elevated.
And what's key there is how quickly even, small increases in borrowing costs add up. The sources mentioned the bill's estimated $3.1 trillion debt increase over 10 years.
Right.
But they point out that recent rate increases could push that figure closer to $5 trillion, maybe even approaching $7 trillion, depending on where rates settle. That makes the fiscal picture look significantly worse.
And you can feel the voter blowback, too. People are unhappy. They're calling their representatives. The sources shared this really striking, almost unbelievable anecdote.
Oh, yeah.
Senator Joni Ernst, when confronted about Medicare concerns, reportedly responded by saying something like, well, everyone is going to die eventually anyway.
Oof. That gives you a sense of the disconnect, doesn't it?
It really does.
And that story highlights a crucial point. How do voters perceive this bill? Especially when you compare its impact on programs like SNAP and Medicaid versus the tax cuts.
Right.
The sources provided a specific list. The 10 wealthiest Republican senators, their estimated net worth, right next to the number of SNAP and Medicaid recipients in their states.
That list is, frankly, potent political ammunition. It creates a ready-made attack line for opponents next election, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Accusing senators of cutting food or health care for constituents while benefiting from tax cuts themselves.
And the sources remind us, whether that attack is literally precise in every detail.
That's how politics works.
That's how it often plays out. As they put it, it ain't beanbag.
Indeed.
We also can't forget the ultimate gatekeeper in the Senate process, the parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough.
Right, the rules referee.
The sources say she and her staff are scrutinizing this bill closely. Two potential sticking points are Section 70302, an attempt to limit federal judges' power, and whether the bill breaks the rules by increasing the deficit beyond the usual 10-year window.
And Senator Thune has publicly said he'll abide by her rulings.
We'll see.
Yeah, whether that holds when, specific critical parts are challenged, that remains to be seen.
The sources also dug into some recent social media posts from the main figure pushing the bill. What's interesting is the tone much more conciliatory than maybe expected.
Oh, how so?
Using phrases like Republican friends, setting a July 4th deadline that feels a bit distant.
Interesting. But what about the substance?
Well, the most notable thing is a specific promise in one post. There will be no CTS to Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid.
Wow. Okay, if that promise is actually kept in the final bill.
Then the budget hawks, the Tea Party wing, they lose completely on those big programs.
Yeah. The sources recall a pattern here, suggesting this figure has a history of, quote, always chickening out on austerity promises when the political heat gets turned up.
So, reading the tea leaves, the sources predict Senate leadership will likely have to strip out things like Section 70302 and most, if not all, of those Medicaid and SNAP cuts just to get enough votes.
Which means the bill sent back to the House will look dramatically different from the one they passed originally.
Yeah.
So the big question becomes, will the hardline Freedom Caucus in the House accept this watered-down version? Or will they dig in?
And the sources observe a trend in this Congress.
Let me guess. The Freedom Caucus also always chickens out.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. It really makes you pause and wonder, as the sources do, about Speaker Johnson's strategy here. Why push that initial bill through the House?
Right. What was the play?
Was it maybe a way to set himself up, provide cover so he could later say, hey, it wasn't my fault, it failed, or didn't cut enough?
It's certainly a plausible read on the situation based on these dynamics. A way to manage expectations, maybe.
Okay, moving on from the legislative maze. The sources touch on another dynamic, equally interesting, maybe, but frankly, much more concerning. It involves this perceived split between a prominent tech billionaire and recent administrative circles.
Ah, yes. The sources suggest this billionaire is trying to shore up both his influence and his public reputation.
But neither effort seems to be going particularly well, according to these reports.
Right. Part of it seems to be this sort of internal purge of associates.
Yeah, the sources mention Jared Isaacman's nomination for a key space agency role, supposedly the billionaire's pick being suddenly yanked.
And the reason given was past associations. Very vague.
Vague, yeah. And we're also seeing top executives leaving one of his major companies, people like Steve Davis, James Burnham.
High-profile departures.
Definitely. And on the personal reputation side, things seem to be taking a hit, too. The sources note that while his alleged drug use might have been an open, not-so-secret in some circles,
right,
a major paper like the New York Times explicitly reporting on it makes it undeniably public knowledge for, well, everyone.
But far more damning, really. The sources highlight reporting from the UK Times. It covers a study by Brooke Nichols at Boston University.
And this study looked specifically at the human cost of policy decisions, linking them to this billionaire's influence.
Yeah, it reportedly crunched the numbers and found a truly horrifying outcome.
Tell us.
Cuts to USAA, which the sources directly connect to this billionaire's policy influence, have allegedly already led to the deaths of 300,000 people.
300,000.
And the sources emphasize the vast majority of those are children.
My God.
The scale is just staggering. About one death every 3 minutes since the administration took office. Nichols herself calls it horrifying in the report. She even set up an online tracker.
A tracker.
Yeah, the sources said as of a recent check, it showed over 210,000 children and over 100,000 adults had died.
It's so stark that the New York Times apparently picked up on it with a headline stating, "This figure's legacy is disease, starvation, and death." Just incredibly blunt.
Yeah, and while the sources report this devastating finding, they also reference, that powerful biblical passage that comes to mind, regardless of personal belief.
Which one?
It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. The sources express hope that this behavior regarding the USAI cuts specifically becomes a lasting, quote, anchor around the necks of those involved.
A heavy thought. Okay, shifting focus again, the sources also zoom in on a deeply worrying trend here in the U.S., the significant rise in anti-Semitic violence.
Right. The Anti-Defamation League numbers are stark. Over 9,300 incidents in 2024. That's up 5% from 2023.
And they're forecasting another 5% jump this year.
So what's fueling this? The sources point to several high-profile incident attacks on a governor's home, the shooting at the Israeli embassy.
And most recently, this attack over the weekend in Boulder, Colorado. A man using a homemade flamethrower on demonstrators supporting Israeli hostages.
Shouting, "Free Palestine," while doing it. He's been arrested, charged with attempted murder. Just horrific.
Horrific. And what's notable is how different figures frame these events. The sources provide a statement from a key political leader responding to Boulder. His focus was almost entirely on the attacker's immigration status, blaming prior border policies, calling for deportation of illegal anti-American radicals.
So the focus was on immigration.
Exclusively. The sources are very clear. The statement made zero mention of Jews, anti-Semitism, or anything in that ballpark. The framing was all about immigrants and, implicitly, Muslims.
Which, according to the sources, feels incongruous, given the administration's public stance against anti-Semitism, actions against universities, etc.
Exactly. The sources cite the New York Times observing that this figure seems most engaged in combating anti-Semitism when it aligns with other goals, like immigration or targeting universities.
Rather than focusing on the physical protection of Jewish people themselves.
That's the analysis presented. The sources use strong language to describe that specific framing.
Understood.
The sources even touch on whether a particular political operative, reportedly a practicing Jew, genuinely cares about anti-Semitism, noting his public focus often seems to be on dislike of brown people and referencing Leviticus on treating strangers.
Complex motivations being questioned there.
But the sources also look at what they see as the other side of this dynamic, the incredibly emotionally charged language coming from different political directions.
Right. It's not just one side using inflammatory rhetoric.
No. One example highlighted is a recent MIT commencement address. The student class president accused the university leadership of enabling genocide.
And apparently delivered a different speech than submitted.
That's what the sources report. They pose the question, what positive good did that speech actually do? Did it change hearts or minds?
Probably not, they suggest, despite cheers and boos. And it could invite retribution.
Right. On the other hand, you have a media figure on cable news calling the entire Free Palestine movement a domestic terror organization.
The source suggests this person is basically paid to be a provocative heel, delivering extreme takes for ratings.
Yeah, which raises this important question. People feel strongly, obviously, but what actual good comes from using such extreme pure good versus pure evil language in this already tense environment?
And the sources argue there's a very clear, very big downside.
Which is?
It makes violent acts, like the ones we've been discussing, seem much easier, lowers the barrier.
Yeah.
And just to put this in broader context, the sources remind us attacks aren't just rising against one group. Attacks on American Muslims were also up significantly in 2024,
right,
projected to rise again this year. Around 9,000 incidents in 2024, very similar numbers to the anti-Semitism stats. It's a widespread issue.
A worrying trend all around. Okay. Stepping back from the U.S. for a moment, the sources also look at how these political currents are playing out internationally, framing a recent election as basically Trumpism versus not Trumpism.
They're talking about the presidential runoff in Poland. Karol Nawrocki narrowly beat Rafał Trzaskowski.
And Nawrocki is described as embodying Trumpism.
Yeah, a right-wing populist, no prior political office, got an endorsement from a former U.S. president, spoke at CPAC here.
And the election was incredibly close, less than 2 percentage points.
Super tight. And the impact is significant for Poland. As president, Nawrocki has veto power.
So, gridlock.
Very likely, the sources predict. Gridlock with the current prime minister, Donald Tusk, whose party doesn't have the votes to override vetoes.
The sources pull out 2 broader takeaways from elections like this around the world. First,
many nations are grappling with this choice. Embrace right-wing populism or not, and the results are often razor-thin.
Yeah. And second,
we seem to still be in an era where votes are often used primarily to punish whoever's currently in power, regardless of their specific ideology. A throw-the-bums-out mentality.
Got it. The sources also briefly mention another significant foreign election happening today in South Korea.
Right. The prediction there, according to the sources, is for a liberal candidate to win pretty easily.
And that's seen as?
Primarily a throw-the-bums-out vote again. blaming the current ruling party largely for a past controversial attempt to impose martial law.
Okay, let's pivot now to that second main source, the research paper. This dive is specifically into the current U.S. debt limit situation, but looking at it purely through the lens of financial markets.
Right. This paper analyzes the 2025 debt limit episode. It technically started January 1st when the last suspension ended. Treasury has been using extraordinary measures since late January to keep paying bills.
But Congress has to act eventually.
Absolutely, to avoid default.
So one key indicator the paper uses is the U.S. Sovereign Credit Default Swap Market, CDS. Basically, insurance against a U.S. default.
And what's really interesting is what the price of that insurance, the CDS premiums, tells us about the market's perceived risk of default.
What did they find?
The paper found that implied risk peaked at 1% right around the November 2024 election.
Okay, 1%. Then what happened?
It fell sharply after news of single-party control in the presidency and Senate. Fell even further, below 0.3%, once the House majority was decided.
So unified government calmed nerves.
Initially, yes. However, it had climbed back up to 1.1% by the time the paper was written in late May 2025.
Back up to 1.1%. So is that high? How does that compare?
And the sources give crucial context here. That 1% to 1.1% peak. It's way below the peaks in prior debt limit fights.
Really?
Yeah. In 2011, implied default risk hit over 6%. In 2013 and 2023, it was well above 4%. So compared to history, the market sees a much lower probability of default this time.
Okay, that's significant. But why are premiums still somewhat elevated then, even if lower?
Well, this connects to a more technical point the paper makes. It's about something called the expected loss given default.
Expected loss.
It's tied to the price of a specific Treasury bond, the cheapest to deliver one in a hypothetical default auction.
And which bond is that?
The paper points to the 30-year Treasury maturing May 2050, the one with tiny 1.25% coupon.
Issued when rates were super low.
Exactly. So because rates have risen so much since 2020, its market price has tanked, fallen by roughly half.
Okay, so if there was a default...
The potential loss for the holder of that bond is much bigger now. So even if the chance of default is seen as lower, the potential severity of loss is higher. That makes insurance sellers demand a higher premium.
Got it. So that specific bond dynamic is pushing premiums up a bit, even with lower perceived default odds.
That's the argument. And this dynamic, tied to that deeply discounted bond, is unique to the 2023 and 2025 episodes compared to 2011 and 2013.
Interesting nuance. The paper also notes the U.S. CDS market itself is pretty small, often dormant.
Right. Trading really picks up during these debt limit fights, so it's probably a better gauge of technical default risk, just missing a payment deadline due to the limit.
Rather than the market thinking the U.S. is truly insolvent.
Exactly.
But the debt limit's impact goes beyond CDS, right? The paper looks at Treasury bills, too.
Yes, especially T-bills maturing right around the expected X date, when Treasury might run out of runway.
The risk being that investors, like money market funds, might just avoid those bills.
Precisely. Fearing payment delays. And that avoidance can distort the prices and yields of those specific bills compared to others maturing just before or after.
So what did they find this time? Are yields distorted?
They compared T-bill yield to OIS rates overnight index swaps, which are less affected by default risk. At the time the paper was written, late May, the distortions for bills maturing late summer 2025 were present but limited, only slightly elevated.
Limited distortion. How does that compare to last time, 1023?
And this is where the contrast is really stark. The paper shows that back in April 2023, bills maturing around the expected X date then were trading at yields about 1 full percentage point higher than surrounding bills.
Wow, 1% higher. That's a huge distortion, much bigger than now.
Much more pronounced market stress reflected in T-bills last time around.
Okay. Finally, the paper talks about the debt limit and bank reserves at the Federal Reserve, especially with the Fed doing quantitative tightening, QT.
Right. So far in this QT cycle, the Fed shrinking its assets has mostly just drained cash from the overnight reverse repo facility, the ON-RRP. Bank reserves have held fairly steady.
But that on-RRP balance is now getting pretty low.
Exactly, which raises a potential issue. Further Fed balance sheet reduction is likely to start pulling down bank reserves directly.
And this interacts with the Treasury's action.
Yes. When the debt limit is hit, Treasury drains its cash account, the TGA. Then, once the limit is lifted, Treasury issues a flood of new debt, often T-bills, to refill the TGA quickly.
Okay, so what's the risk there?
The risk the paper highlights is, if Treasury issues a huge amount of bills quickly to rebuild the TGA, and that RRP facility balance is already very low.
That new debt issuance could suddenly drain a lot of cash out of bank reserves.
Potentially, yes, causing funding market stress.
This concern has led to talk about the Fed slowing down QT.
It has. And the paper notes the Fed did announce in March it would slow the pace of Treasury runoff, reducing the monthly cap significantly starting in June.
And the market expected this.
Largely anticipated, yes. Market forecasts cited in the Paper Now project that bank reserves will remain ample, partly because the Fed slowed QT. But the on-NRP balance will fall to very low levels, while the TGA gets rebuilt smoothly.
The paper makes an important point about asymmetry, though.
Right. Debt limit episodes during QT, like now, are potentially more disruptive to reserves than episodes during QE, when the Fed was actively adding reserves.
Makes sense.
And they point out, in 2023, even though QT was happening, the on-NRP balance was massive, over $2 trillion when the limit was resolved.
A huge buffer.
A huge buffer that easily absorbed the Treasury's cash rebuild without stressing reserves.
Yeah.
That buffer just isn't there this time. Makes the Fed's decision to slow QT seem quite prudent.
Okay, wow. That was quite a journey through this stack. We've covered a major budget bill facing intense political headwinds, deeply concerning reports linking policy to human cost, the worrying rise in charged rhetoric and real-world violence, echoes in global elections, and this detailed look at how markets are viewing the debt limit lower perceived default risk than before, but still, unique technical risks around bond prices and reserves this time.
It really underscores just how interconnected all these things are.
Yeah.
Political strategy, economic consequences, social impacts, global currents.
Yeah.
They all feed into each other.
Absolutely. Making sense of it means connecting these seemingly separate dots.
And recognizing that even in technical areas like finance, the market response isn't simple. It's nuanced, depends on the specific context, the history.
So what does this all boil down to for you, the listener? It's a reminder, really, that these political battles aren't abstract games. They have real effects.
Yeah, on programs, on people.
It shows that the words used in public discourse matter. They can have dangerous consequences. And even technical things like the debt limit, while maybe viewed differently by markets each time, have far-reaching implications for the financial system, for stability.
Definitely.
Let's leave you with one final thought, something built on what we've discussed, for you to mull over. The sources noted the debt limit itself was created way back in 1917.
A long time ago.
Yeah. Originally meant to make borrowing easier, maybe later intended to force Congress to confront debt. But in recent decades, mostly due to political polarization, it seems to just repeatedly push the country to the brink.
Creating market jitters, uncertainty.
All without actually solving the underlying fiscal issues it was maybe supposed to address.
So, given these recurring near misses, the documented market disruptions, it raises an important question to think about.
Which is?
Why do we even keep this debt limit mechanism? And maybe more critically, how can we actually have effective discussions about long-term debt sustainability in Congress that avoid this repetitive high-stakes political brinkmanship?
Something to think about. That's been our deep dive for today.